Imagine standing in the heart of London in the year 1305. The morning sun cuts through a haze of smoke, the air thick with the smell of sweat, ale, and horse dung. The streets thrum with noise, hawkers calling, wheels grinding, the chatter of a restless city. But beneath that familiar clamor lies something heavier, a tension that clings to the skin like mist. Today is no ordinary day. Today, the city waits to see a man erased. Crowds surge toward Smithfield, not for a market fair nor for royal celebration, but for a ritual of cruelty. The execution of William Wallace, Scotland's most defiant rebel. To Edward I Longshanks, he was not simply an enemy. He was a contagion, a symbol that had to be destroyed. But Wallace's death would not be swift. It was to be theater. Every detail scripted, every moment choreographed, so that his suffering would echo through generations. Later poets would turn him into legend, and Hollywood into a martyr who died with a single heroic cry. But the truth, the forgotten truth, was infinitely darker. This is not the story of a noble end. This is the story of a man reduced to spectacle, a death so cruel it became something greater than itself. A haunting echo that would outlive both executioner and king. To understand why Wallace's end was staged with such deliberate malice, we must step back and see the man not as myth, but as flesh and blood. William Wallace was no mighty lord. He came from minor nobility, a man who might have lived and died in obscurity had grief not carved him into legend. Scotland at the end of the 13th century was a fractured land, its crown contested, its people caught between survival and submission. For many nobles, bowing to Edward was practical. For Wallace, submission was unthinkable. His hatred of English rule was not born from politics, but from loss. Family stripped away, his land plundered, his dignity crushed. Out of grief came fury, and out of fury came defiance. He did not fight for a throne, but for the raw, simple right of his people to breathe free. In 1297, at Stirling Bridge, he showed the world that defiance could triumph. Against England's armored cavalry, Wallace and his men, farmers, laborers, common folk, broke the illusion of invincibility. That victory was more than military. It was psychological. For the first time, Scotland saw that the empire could bleed. But triumph cast a shadow. To Edward, Wallace was a rebel who threatened order. To Scotland's nobles, he was a dangerous outsider who commanded loyalty without titles. His rise shamed their compromises, his victories mocked their submission. Wallace was a leader without permission, a voice that reminded them of their silence. He became not just a man, but a symbol. And symbols, as Edward I knew well, cannot be allowed to survive. After Stirling, Wallace was hunted with a new intensity. Edward understood that rebellion spreads like fire, and fire must be stamped out at its source. But it wasn't only the English king who turned against him. Scotland's aristocracy, cowed and calculating, found in Wallace a mirror they could not bear. His resistance exposed their weakness. His defiance made their surrender shameful. So the noose tightened. Edward's spies seeped through villages. Coins whispered loyalty from one man's hand to another. Friends became uncertain. Allies faltered. Every tavern, every crossroad carried the risk of betrayal. Picture the weight upon him. Once hailed as Scotland's liberator, now slipping through shadows, never sure who might sell his freedom for gold or safety. Each glance over his shoulder carried the gnawing question, who among them will break me? The answer came in August 1305. Near Glasgow, Wallace was seized, not by English steel, but by Scottish hands. Sir John Menteith, a knight who had bent to Edward's will, delivered him. The capture was not a battle, not a duel of warriors. It was betrayal in its purest form. In that moment, Wallace's body was bound, but more crushing than chains was the knowledge that his own countrymen had surrendered him. Scotland had not simply lost its champion, it had abandoned him. London rejoiced. Edward triumphed. But Wallace's descent was only beginning. The true theater had yet to open its curtain. Capture was not enough. For Edward I, death alone would not suffice. The rebel's fall had to be paraded, drawn out like a slow bleed, a warning carved into the very roads of England. and so Wallace was bound in irons, dragged not swiftly to his end, but hauled deliberately through towns and villages on his way to London. Each stop became a stage. Here was the great defier of kings, no longer astride a horse with sword in hand, but bound and filthy, paraded like spoil from a hunt. The crowds gathered thick. Some spat, others shouted curses. A rotten apple struck his chest. A boy laughed and pointed at the man who once defied an empire. And yet, not all voices jeered. Many watched in silence, unease written in their faces. In Wallace's humiliation, they glimpsed both cruelty and fear. This was not transportation. It was punishment before punishment. A campaign of psychological torment designed to crush him before he ever reached the scaffold. Days blurred into weeks. Every village became another reminder of his fall. The iron bit his wrists. The cobblestones shredded his flesh. Yet through the jeers and filth, Wallace's eyes remained fixed forward, seeing perhaps not the streets of England, but the green hills of Scotland fading behind him. By the time London's towers came into view, his body was bruised and battered, his spirit tested. The capital awaited him not with quiet judgment, but with a carnival. For the man who had lit rebellion, the city had prepared not a trial of law, but a festival of cruelty. On August 23, 1305, inside the vaulted stone of Westminster Hall, William Wallace stood before the crown. Yet the proceedings that followed were no more trial than the parade had been a journey. Everything here was performance. The hall itself was the stage. Banners hung, clerics and nobles assembled, the Latin tongue echoing off the stone. Wallace, likely unable to grasp the words, stood as an audience to his own condemnation. The charges cascaded in a litany: treason, murder, arson, sacrilege. But treason was the heart of it, the brand that would justify the worst of punishments. The irony was bitter. Wallace had never sworn fealty to Edward. To call him traitor was to claim Scotland belonged to England by right. Resistance itself was criminalized as betrayal. When invited to speak, Wallace gave his only defense, simple and cutting. I could not be guilty of treason, for I was never Edward's subject. That sentence, defiant and unbowed, cut sharper than any blade. In chains, he denied Edward's sovereignty. Even as a prisoner, he refused to bend. But defiance could not change the script. The judges were Edward's men. The verdict had been written long before Wallace entered the hall. With ceremonial gravity, they pronounced the sentence. He was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged but not killed, disemboweled alive, beheaded and quartered. Each act, they declared, carried meaning: dragging for degradation, hanging for rejection by heaven, disembowelment for corruption of the spirit, quartering for annihilation. This was not judgment, it was ritual. Edward's theater of cruelty was ready for its final act. On the morning of August 23, 1305, London awoke with an uneasy anticipation. For days, the people had whispered of what was to come. The rebel who had defied a king would be taken through the city, and the streets swelled with thousands eager to witness it. Wallace was bound to a wooden frame, drawn slowly through the busiest quarters of London. The journey was deliberate, a spectacle arranged to magnify his downfall. The clatter of hooves echoed on the stones, mingling with the voices of vendors and the restless cries of the crowd. Along the route, some jeered, others hurled insults, while many simply watched in silence. Children pressed against their mothers' skirts, merchants leaned from their stalls, and travelers stood still as the procession passed. For the English crown, this was not transportation. It was a living message. Defiance would be paraded, displayed, and undone before the eyes of all. And yet witnesses record that Wallace's gaze never wavered. He did not shout, nor did he plead. His eyes fixed forward, as if searching for something beyond the crowd, something unseen. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps defiance, or perhaps only the quiet knowledge of what awaited at the end of the road. At last, the frame reached Smithfield. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising into a storm of expectation. The long passage was complete. Before them stood not a commander on horseback, but a man delivered to judgment, his fate no longer in question. The procession was over. The final act was about to begin. At Smithfield, the The crowd swelled into a sea of faces, thousands pressing forward to glimpse the rebels' final moments. To them, this was not justice. It was theater. And the scaffold was the stage where cruelty itself would be performed. Wallace was hoisted onto the platform, battered from the long procession but still conscious. The first act began. Hanging, the rope tightened around his neck, his body jerking in violent spasms. The crowd watched as his face darkened, lips straining for breath. But death was not allowed. Before it could claim him, the rope was cut. He collapsed to the boards, gasping, dragged back from mercy into suffering. Then the knife came. The executioner opened him with practiced precision. Steam rose into the summer air as entrails were pulled from his body, lifted high for all to see. Witnesses said his screams did not sound human, but like something torn from the depths of existence itself. Each organ was thrown into the fire, flames devouring what medieval belief saw as the seat of compassion. The message was clear. Not only would his body be destroyed, but his very humanity would be reduced to ash. And still, Wallace remained aware. His eyes, wide and unblinking, followed the ritual of his own unmaking. Whether it was defiance, resignation, or the final tether of will, no one could say. But he did not beg. At last came the merciful stroke, the axe falling clean, severing his head in a single swing. The crowd erupted as the executioner held it aloft, blood still dripping. Yet even this was not the end. His body was carved into 4 parts, each piece displayed like butchered meat before the crowd, each destined for a different corner of the kingdom. This was not an execution. It was choreography. A carefully arranged sequence of pain and spectacle, cruelty elevated into ritual. Wallace had been destroyed, not simply as a man, but as an idea made flesh. But death was not the conclusion Edward sought. Wallace's body was dismantled, his remains turned into instruments of propaganda. His head, blackened with tar, was mounted on London Bridge, a grim sentinel leering down at travelers entering the city by water. For years it stood there, a warning suspended above the Thames, the face of defiance, silenced in death, yet still watching. The quarters of his body were scattered deliberately. Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth, each fragment nailed in public, each town forced to confront the fate of rebellion. Markets bustled beneath his limbs. Children walked past them on their way to church. His absence became omnipresent, his destruction hammered into the daily rhythm of life. Edward had intended a masterpiece of terror. Wallace's body was transformed into a map of conquest, scattered across the soil he had fought to defend. He was everywhere and nowhere, both erased and inescapable. And yet, the king's cruelty betrayed him. For in every display, the memory of Wallace did not fade. It grew. His death became story. His fragments became symbol. His absence became presence. Edward had destroyed the man, but in doing so, he had created the martyr. Edward believed he had crushed Scotland by tearing Wallace apart. His message was written in blood and fire. This is the fate of traitors. For a moment, fear seemed to prevail. Nobles bent deeper to England's rule. Peasants whispered Wallace's name only in secret. But cruelty has a way of echoing louder than obedience. The horror of Wallace's death could not be contained. The spectacle Edward crafted to extinguish resistance instead became a spark that smoldered in the minds of those who saw it, and those who only heard the tales. In Scotland, people carried the trauma like a wound. They saw their champion torn apart, yet they also saw the measure of England's rule. Wallace had not died as a criminal, but as a man who refused to bend. His silence on the scaffold, his defiance in the Hall of Westminster, became rallying cries. Robert the Bruce, a man once hesitant, torn between survival and rebellion, was among those who felt the weight of that moment. Wallace's destruction showed him the truth. Under Edward, there was no dignity in compromise, only degradation. Out of Wallace's ashes, Bruce found the resolve to rise. Even beyond Scotland's borders, the spectacle stained Edward's reputation. Across Europe, whispers carried of England's cruelty, of a king who made art out of torment. The message Edward meant to send, that rebellion was futile, was overshadowed by the revelation that rebellion was preferable to submission. In death, Wallace had achieved what he never fully could in life. He was no longer just William Wallace, the rebel knight. He was William Wallace, the martyr, a man whose broken body proved unbreakable in memory. Centuries have passed, yet the echo of that day has never faded. Wallace's story has been retold in chronicles, songs, and films, reshaped again and again, each generation sanding away the unbearable cruelty, each artist polishing the horror into something heroic. But beneath the myth, the truth still lingers. Wallace did not die quickly. He was erased slowly, piece by piece, in a theater of pain. The most chilling part is not the executioner's blade, but the crowd. They were not monsters. They were bakers, merchants, mothers with children on their shoulders, ordinary people who laughed and cheered while cruelty unfolded before them. Civilization does not abolish brutality, it simply wraps it in ritual, makes it palatable, even festive. And yet within that darkness, something endures. Wallace's body was dismantled, but his defiance remained intact. In silence, in refusal, he carried dignity to the very end. That paradox, that the human spirit can endure even as flesh is annihilated, is what transformed his death into legend. In Scotland, the trauma became memory. Memory became identity. To be Scottish was to carry Wallace, not only as a warrior of battles long lost, but as a reminder that liberty carries a cost measured in blood. Edward's spectacle failed because cruelty, when stretched beyond measure, creates martyrs instead of warnings. Wallace's head may have rotted on London Bridge, but his story lives, retold in ballads and etched into stone, reshaped into a cry that still unsettles the air. Freedom. The lesson. William Wallace's death is not just history, it is a mirror. It shows us how fragile freedom is, how easily cruelty masquerades as justice, how swiftly ordinary people can cheer the unthinkable. But it also shows us that dignity can outlive flesh, and that symbols are born not in victory, but in sacrifice. The question his story leaves behind is the one that haunts us still. When dignity and fear collide, which will we choose?